My name is Jeremy, and this is Good Beer Matters.
In Belgium, nobody wants to drink non-Belgian beer. Why would you? That's the attitude of Belgians. For me, the beer is never really the protagonist. It's usually a tool that I can use to tell a human story. Just savor it and savor the people that you're with, and that's how to enjoy Belgian beer, you know? You don't put it in boxes.
Belgium holds one of the richest beer cultures in the world, but with a history and culture as diverse as theirs, beer is only the beginning. My next guest is a master storyteller who guides us even deeper into the world beyond the beer we already know and love. We find great experiences at the intersection of craft and culture. These are the stories of us, of great food and the beer that brings it all together. For the craft and culture of beer, this is episode 141 of Good Beer Matters with Breandán, Kearney. Welcome back to the Good Beer Matters podcast. This one has been in the making for a while. I have been a search for the perfect guide to the world of Belgium through its beer. Granted, many of us know Belgian beer, but those of us, myself included, who have never been to Belgium, don't really know what that culture is like, and in particular because it's so diverse and so interesting and so rich. It's hard to put your thumb on it, even if you are on the ground. From what I've heard from people who have been on the ground, but today I found the perfect guide to take us through the world of Belgium and her beer. So, Breandán Kearney, if I pronounce that right, please forgive me. But
That's
welcome
pretty
to the
good.
Good Beer, welcome to the Good Beer Matters podcast.
Thanks very much. It's great to be on. Thanks, Jeremy.
Well, the pleasure's mine, because not only are you our guide for Belgian beer, but you're also a writer, a photographer, and a podcaster. I think a few years ago I took second place in some award, and you took first. So, because what you're doing is it's just really wonderful. Um, uh, eh, but tell us about really who you are, and tell us about the work you've been doing in beer in particular.
So I kind of manage a website and podcast about Belgian beer and Belgian beer culture called Belgian Smaak, which really is kind of serves my own curiosity as well as it does kind of tries to inform and entertain people who are looking to learn more about Belgian beer. I write for a number of other publications as well, the Brussels Times magazine, Good Beer Hunting. I've written for National Geographic, Lonely Planet, Pellicle magazine, Craft Beer and Brewing magazine, and I'm actually working on a book at the minute called Hidden Beers of Belgium, which is going to try and celebrate and profile some of the lesser known beers with pretty compelling stories. So I'm living in Belgium, originally from Ireland, and I'm telling these stories as a way to help myself understand this weird and wonderful place that I now live.
That's a great point. You're talking about how you're telling these stories to the rest of us, which is great because there's so much behind a story, and I've got a separate question about that in and of itself. But why is it that by telling these stories, by learning these stories, by the fact that by reporting on a place, you have a better understanding of it? Why does that? Why is that?
Well, I think it's just a case of like spending time sitting with something. Time affords you the chance to like make more observations. Time, importantly, affords you the chance to ask more questions, and you get, I think, a more realistic perspective on things if you can see it across seasons with different people in different moods at different times. And yeah, so you kind of you can see all the romanticism as well as all the frustrations and the challenges that come with being or doing a certain thing in this place. So I think just being on the ground is it's the same with any type of reporting. If you have someone on the ground, I think they can go a little bit deeper, and they pick up by osmosis other sort of cultural aspects which influence, you know, the writing about a particular subject, whether that's in politics or language
Yeah,
or other sort of more cultural
and how
elements.
they're
So
interwoven together, right?
exactly, and that kind of gives you a slightly different window than if you're looking from afar.
And I think most of us, if I were to use a horrible analogy, most of us, and I lump myself into this, and we already talked about that offline and even on this, but we study the Belgian beer to become a cicerone, to become a BJCP judge, and those of us who love beer, the vast majority of us love Belgian beer, and so we think we have a good sense of what Belgium is like, but I mean that's kind of like speed dating, where I'm going to try and get to know someone by speed dating, as opposed to just spending hours, weeks, months, truly having conversation, getting to know that person.
Those programs are really good. I've also done the Cicerone and the BGCP and stuff, and they're really comprehensive and they're very well thought out. But like, yeah, exactly. It's I know that they're working with people that are also based in Belgium, which is really important. But sometimes you get kind of a richer look at things if you're living here. It's also the reason that I don't write about German beer. I don't write about Czech beer. Don't write about English beer. Occasionally, I will do a story on Irish beer, but I think I'm also permitted to do that, given that I spent most of my life up until 7 or 8 years ago living in Ireland, growing up in Ireland. So I kind of I think I can navigate that a little bit better. But
Yes.
my my wheelhouse is definitely Belgium.
The other thing you talked about is stories, and I am utterly fascinated with stories. Probably I'm more fascinated with stories than beer, if I were to be perfectly honest with anyone listening and watching. But why are stories so central to an experience? Why are stories so central to a sense of place?
Oh, we're getting really deep now already at the start.
Yes, we
I
are.
mean, stories are just the best way for humans to understand something. So, um, what I'm looking for is something that showcases, teaches us about ourselves. So, if I can find something within Belgian beer that's interesting to people that are interested in how it's brewed or the history of a particular product, but they can also learn something, applicable for themselves. That's kind of what I'm looking for. I don't always find it. It's not always easy, but that kind of universality will make the story more
Yeah.
compelling. So what is it that these people have overcome to achieve this or to create this beer, or how did they approach it in a way that we can learn something about, being creative, or um, how did they roll with the punches, and we can just learn stuff from in our own life. So that's kind of the essence. And within story, then you need certain story elements which you're always trying to find. And because it's nonfiction, of course, if they didn't happen, then you can't write them in. So you have to do enough reporting so that you can find the elements that will make it more compelling. And if you don't have those elements, then maybe it's just not a good enough story to write or to do a long form narrative podcast on.
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of and there are frustrating times when you spend a lot of time talking to people and looking into something, and there just isn't anything there. There's no dramatic tension. There's no change. There's no arc. There's no sort of plot points or any element of kind of
Oh,
crisis or
yeah. We're getting into a master class on storytelling, aren't we?
yeah. But those are the things you kind of need. It's like why is it important, and where how does it move, and you can do that with any story, as long as it's got all those elements. So it doesn't matter that it's Belgian beer, because within Belgian beer you basically have 7 or 8 generational family brewers who are navigating change of ownership, who are navigating um, a changing beer landscape that's looking towards different use of hops, that's looking towards lower alcohol, that's looking towards different markets and business decisions. Um, you've got a whole sort of regional element to Belgian beer where people are speaking different languages. There's 3 official languages in Belgium, none of which are English.
Yeah.
Um, you've got a kind of a history which creates a kind of a particular pragmatic and hard and sort of hard to stop personality. That's Belgian brewers are
That's
noted for
very well
being
put.
relatively conservative in like
Yeah.
how they brew, with a lot of focus on balance and not making too many changes all at once to previous batches. But actually, they'll be able to to because of just the character of the nation, the kind of understated pragmatism, that they'll be able to um, navigate almost any problem that comes up, whether it's tax related or ingredient related, or so. All of those things make Belgian beer like a conservative, slow moving, but also sort of juxtapositionally innovative place to brew. So those are kind of I mean, with that background, there's plenty of stuff you can write about. So um, yeah, it's pretty rich in story, and I mean, I've only scratched the surface myself.
Well, I find it interesting that you call it conservative when we think about Belgian beer, we think about more the more creative of the bunch, and it's but of course you said there's a practical history to why that is and everything else. Before I dive down that, there's something you said about story that just really caught my ear, and you think about so I also talk about story with work and give talks on it and that sort of stuff. And one of the things I talk about is the difference between an anecdote and a story. We can compare that to a beer. You mentioned like a beer that just a general mass produced one note, one flavor. It's you drink it and you move on, don't think about it twice. To me, that's like an anecdote. An anecdote is basically a story without a point. It's like one time me and Breandán went to a pub and we had a beer and it was awesome. The end. That's an anecdote. That's a one note beer.
Hmm.
And this is a great analogy to kind of the difference between big beer and craft beer or artisanal beer. The story, however, is has that challenge, has that story arc, has all those elements that you mentioned just a few minutes ago. And if it's told well, if there's a real story there, if the beer has enough complexity, then we're going to be thinking about that beer. We're going to be thinking about that story for days, weeks, years, who knows how long. And it's going to sit with us. It's going to affect how we think about things. It's going to change our perspective and even our trajectory on life. And here I am waxing poetic again. But that's what a good story can do. That's what a good beer can do. And it sounds like you're finding these elements or trying to find these elements there in Belgium.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, to give your example, I always go with I always lead with the human. So you've given an example there of how like a beer can be maybe the protagonist of a story, and you talked about the
Yeah.
flavor profile and all these ester compounds and the way it's fermented and everything. For me, the beer is never really the protagonist. It's usually a tool that I can use to tell a human story. Um, so within the production of that beer, there'll be a whole series of events, decisions that were taken, things that happened to them that maybe prevented them from making the beer that they had to overcome. Um, and the decisions informed like how that beer eventually became unique. So I'm always trying to go with the human. So for your example there, which was, or your anecdote, which is like the non-story,
Yeah.
where Jeremy and Breandán went to the pub, the end, right?
Yeah.
So what my mind immediately goes to, Jeremy and Breandán went to the pub. Before they went, Jeremy didn't like acidic beers. So during the course of the evening, Breandán served to Jeremy a bière de table from La Brasserie La Jungle, then a Ode Bruin van der Henste from Brouwerij Omer van der Henste, and then he served a Girardin Black Label Eau de Geuze. And by the end of the evening, Jeremy liked sour beer. And then you have some sort of a change. Now, that's not a very compelling or dynamic story, but within that you have some sort of an arc, and that's that. Then you
Yeah.
starting to have more of a story. And now we think, oh, now we need some sort of a refusal of the call. So Jeremy doesn't want to like sour beer. So then we put that element there. Now
Jeremy's clearly the villain in the story.
well, no, Jeremy is the protagonist. I'm just the guide. I'm
Yeah.
the mentor character, right? So,
Yeah.
and then we build in a refusal of the call. Then there's something that happens, or some sort of an inciting incident that pushes him into actually to go into the pub, and then we work towards some sort of a climax, where there are stakes. And if you don't have stakes, then why would anybody care about anything? So
Yeah.
I mean, this is just a very very basic example of where I would go with this, and try and find all those elements. Again, when you're reporting and you're dealing with nonfiction, you kind of have to um, you honor the facts of what you find, and make sure that it's factually true. So that's all. That's an added element when you're dealing with nonfiction as compared to fiction. But Um, and the Americans are very good at this. I mean, some of the best narrative writing comes from American magazine culture, and that's where I learned a lot of the stuff that I try to do. I'm not sure if I always pull it off, but it's kind of a big
Yeah.
influence on me.
Well, and I think about that too. It's like, I just reporting on the who, what, when, where, how, and why type of reporting is it's necessary. It's good, but
I mean, it's a whole
when
other skill set, and I mean, I
yeah,
absolutely have so much respect for people that do that. Where you can define the hierarchy of your information in terms of its importance, and that's a whole skill set in itself. And then that's usually that type of reporting involves very quick turnaround, so you need to know exactly where you need to go for source information. You need to
yeah,
get it quickly. Whereas my game is a whole lot longer. I'm usually driving to places and spending a few days. I'm spending a few months talking to different people, reading reports, or reading some background information. So that's a whole other different game, and I have so
yeah.
much respect for people that are doing that kind of news reporting.
And I never did that type of writing. Here we're talking about writing now, and not Belgium or beer, but we'll circle back around. uh, I love the idea of having that structure and knowing I need to get this information so I can plug it into my structure so I can tell a quick, compelling story and turn this around and get this out by 2, 3 o'clock, whatever it is. That never resonated with me. I was always more interested in the experience. I was always more interested in being the guide to an
Hmm.
experience. I was always ever since I remember it was 11th grade English class. I remember for the first time hearing the question that drives everything I do, and I spend my life trying to answer the question, so what? And for me, when we talk about these beers, when we talk about this culture, the reason why I do this podcast is I want to answer so what. And you mentioned it before. If there's not enough information there to put together the story, then you have to resist the temptation to make stuff up. But maybe the story isn't there. Maybe there is no good answer to the question, so what? At least in my regard. But that's the fun part is we're trying to find those stories that do answer the question.
Yeah, I mean, you just said it there, like you've gone back to your 11-year-old self talking about
Yeah.
finding the story, and asking why it matters. And I don't mean to therapize you, but in the title of your podcast is "Good Beer Matters," so you're trying to
Yeah.
figure out why it's important.
Yeah.
So I don't want to turn this into a therapy session, but like this is
I
obviously
know
something that
we'll be
drives
here all
you.
day, so let's not. So, but I think we're both seeking the same thing. We're both trying to find the stories that change you, but tell them in such a way where it does take you on a journey. It does take you on a experience, so that by the end you're changed, even if it's just a fraction. The taste of that particular beer, the note of that particular food, or just that little storyline. If it's told well enough, if it tastes good enough, if it's complex enough, then maybe that will just adjust your trajectory by 1 degree. But as you and I both know, if you're off 1 degree over 100 miles or 100 kilometers, that's quite a big difference than where
Yeah,
you would have been.
yeah.
And I think that's the whole point of all this for me.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the last couple of stories we've done on Belgian Smack, for example, just to illustrate that point, and it's almost like a little bit selfish because I we would have questions, myself or people that are writing on the site, and then we would try to distill that into a longer story. So, for example, recently Owen Walsh, who's an Irish guy, also based here in Belgium, he lives in Brussels. He we were talking about the Belgian coast, and the Belgian coast is
Mhm.
kind of the place that Belgians and foreigners love to hate. It's kind of grey, it's beige, it's high-rise apartments, and it's always overcrowded in the summer. It doesn't get particularly good weather. Um, there are parts of it which are really ugly. And we thought, well, is there anything in terms of beer and food that can tell us a little bit more about the Belgian coast, and we can find out what it's actually really like, rather than this kind of surface level judgment of it. So Owen goes up. He spends several days on the tram, which goes the whole length of the coast, 67 kilometers. It's the longest existing remaining tram line in the world. and stopping off on various stops across the different towns on the coast, drinking, eating, talking to farmers, talking to restaurants. And what comes back is, rather than this grey, kind of beige, boring, ugly place, this very, very colourful place with a lot of history to do with the fishermen that have worked there over centuries and suffered a lot of tragedy, the war that's been there, the kind of industry of the people there, the kind of Art Nouveau and literary vibes that people came there in its grand epoch, and the sort of the contemporary places to eat and drink. So you have this kind of whole other story. And while the change is very small there, it's still significant because it's, our perception of this place goes from being, one thing to another. Um, that can also be done if I see a particular iconic beer. Why is this beer iconic? It's everywhere. How did it come about? And then that's like, for example, like the story we did on Omer, which is like a strong blonde verging on a golden strong ale. And it's kind of everywhere in West Flanders. It's ubiquitous. It's extremely successful commercially. And the story of how that beer was concocted is totally linked to the history of the family that runs the brewery. The firstborn son of whom is called Omer in every single generation as a first name. So when you're born as the oldest, you get christened with the name because of the stained glass windows, because of the heritage and legacy of the brewery. And when you put your name on the beer, you better make sure that it's going to be good. So there was a lot of stakes for that, for a big family regional brewery that owns a lot of cafe properties. Or it could be doing a story on a new arrival, sort of a younger brewery like Brasserie La Jungle, or Eilenbosch, Huze Eilenbosch, or De Coureur is a new cycling themed tap room in Leuven. A lot of these guys opened in the middle of a pandemic, on the face of a global energy crisis, supply chain problems. Um, how do you do that? And what do you do as a new arrival? Do you just deliver more of the Belgian blondes, or do you become more influenced with international styles and the seductive qualities of the Yakima hop? Or, so all those kind of, why the hell would you open a brewery in Belgium now, and what's going to be your differentiator, are questions that can be answered in a story where there's change and there's plot points. So those are just like, because we've been
Yeah.
talking in sort of generalizations, and I just wanted to give some examples of like some of the stories we actually do, because we do actually drink Belgian beer and write about it.
Yeah. Well, that's good. And I did listen to that story when Owen went to the coast, and one of the things that was kind of like an extra little spice on the dish was the fact that he hates the coast, and I love the coast. So I was listening to that, thinking, okay, talk me out of loving the coast. I was like, okay, tell me why you hate it, and
Yeah.
just kind of see how it all evolved was just really really cool. Um, when we talk about there's so many questions I want to ask, but I'm forcing myself to focus because I'm geeking out a little bit right now between story, beer, culture, everything. When it comes to the beer, and you just kind of led into this, a lot of Belgian beer, is not that old, not as old as we think it might be. Maybe 100 years, maybe a little bit more. But what's happening now with all of this heritage beer in Belgium in the wake of all this craft beer and craft boom and demand for all that sort of stuff?
That's a good question. I think first of all, the word craft is not that commonly used here, compared to, like, if you go to the UK, it's every second brewery is a craft beer brewery. There's a craft beer bar. Um, well, I never use that word in writing because I'm it's not used really that much in Belgian beer, and
Sure.
I don't think it. I mean, I know it's officially defined by the Brewers Association in the States,
Yeah, but
and that definition has been fluid. And I'm not making any judgments there. I'm just sort the its usefulness to me to convey the type of brewery I'm talking about in Belgium is limited. So it's not something I talk about. But in terms of like the influence
well,
of
what if
new,
what? Sorry to cut you off, but what if we were to translate that into heritage beer versus innovative beer?
yeah, so a lot of the newer, more exciting people are not brewing IPAs. They're brewing like heritage styles like Eau de Huze. And
Oh,
maybe,
good.
right. So there's, I mean, are they heritage or so all this? Like this is maybe this is also a good point to make about Belgian brewing is that I know because of Cicerone and BJCP and the kind of the vastness of American beer that people are keen to put things in boxes, but it's
Hmm.
quite difficult in Belgium
Hmm.
because, and again, this is also related to culture and history. If you look at how Belgium is divided regionally, it's kept a lot of its regionality. And of course, in Germany and in the Czech Republic and in the UK and in America, there is regionality in beer. But I have a feeling that the globalization of beer is is kind of has had less of an impact in Belgium, partly because of its like federal divided structure, partly because of its linguistic background, partly because of its history. But you know, largely in the Westhoek, you still have all the hops. You still have a lot of tradition of classic Belgian ales. In the southwest Flanders, you have Oud Bruin, verging into the Flemish Ardennes near Oudenaarde. There's a discussion about Flemish red versus Oud Bruin, which
Hmm.
you know we could go into if you want. You know, historically around Leuven, Hageland, Vlaams Brabant, you had cultivation of wheat, so that was where kind of all wheat wheat variant beers originally came from. You know, coming more commercial in the 1960s with Pierre Celis and the purchase
Yeah.
of who hadn't by Interbrew at the time.
Hmm.
Um, you know, the fruit growing region of the Haspenhau, which is you know now being you know changed a lot, but at one time would have influenced a lot of like the cherry and the creek sort of ingredients that were served up to the rest of Belgium. And then, of course, you have the uh, the six Belgian Trappies, now five Belgian Trappies Dabbies, who are spread across sort of the north and south. And you know, so there is kind of this regionality which persists, and all of that, as well as the kind of the linguistic changes, and the fact that it's such a small country bordered by you know the UK across the water, France on one side, which is a wine country, and Germany to the east, which is you know a big lager country. You know all those influences. It's everything bleeds into each other, and that's why it's very difficult to say that this is exactly this and X is X and Y is Y. So I think the box thing, and I know that other international writers and Americans, people like Joe Stang, who's now the editor at Craft Beer and Brewing, who's lived in Belgium for a while, also says this that you know trying to put things in boxes is maybe not the right approach. Although it's the natural thing to do, because how else do we try to work things out? You know.
Well, and I think about I think about beer styles, and even I've got a podcast talking about beer styles called Sense of Beer Style. Sorry for the plug, but I'm going to plug it. And we're talking about the styles. Frankly, I'm not a fan of styles. I'm not a fan of putting things in boxes. But how else are you and I going to communicate about this specific kind of beer, where it could take us 2 minutes and a whole paragraph to describe? I'm thinking of something sour, kind of brown, malty, balsamic-y, but in the best way possible. Comes from the northern part of Belgium, or I could just say an old brown. You know, so there is. Let's unpack this a little bit, because there is an advantage to being able to just call a duck, but not all ducks are the same, and that's kind of what you're getting to. So how do the Belgians go about just discussing style in a efficient manner?
Um, they're not that even like this is both consumers, general
Mhm.
public brewers. They're not that particular. Let's say.
Okay.
Um, so like the discussion we mentioned there about Oud Brown and Flemish Red, like
Yeah.
the term on the ground
Which,
wherever
by the
you
way,
are.
I like your pronunciation way better than mine. So just want to add that.
I'm just repeating what they tell me. Um, you know, everyone knows it as Oud Brown, and I think there had to be some distinction made to explain the difference between you know fermentation, open fermentation in stainless steel versus sort of aging in oak, French oak barrels. Um, and even the whole definition of Old Brown, Odenad's Old Brown is largely led by Leaf Bonds, which is now bought by Duvel Morticat, and it's kind of like a the heritage baby that they're still carrying. Um, but on the ground, it's old brown. If it's slightly dark and got a little bit of acid, it's an old brown, and that's just like, it doesn't really matter. And even when I ask brewers sometimes, like, what is it, and they haven't even thought about it sometimes. Which is really strange, because how the hell are you going to sell it? You
Yeah.
know, because when I walk into a bar and I want to know what it is. A lot of the times you don't even get, like, they'll just tell you what color it is, maybe, or they'll tell you what alcohol it is, and you'll just have to kind of order it and see. But so that's um and that's strange in a place with such a diversity of beer styles, from bitter, dry, to very sweet and malty, to acidic, to kind of, even like the Belgian interpretation of international styles, like when the UK brought their stouts and porters, in sort of in the interwar period, they became quite popular. And then they were using maybe more characterful yeast, and maybe making the beer slightly sweeter. So that kind of developed into a whole different thing. So yeah, it's there's definitely more fluidity in terms of like the description of it.
Well, I I think it kind of reminds me of back in the day in the U.S. pre-craft beer boom. Like a lot of countries, we had three beers; they were all the same. And these days, you get some people who harken back to that time, and they say, "quote unquote," "I want beer flavored beer, not this new craft BS
Yeah.
that some of us are enjoying." Yeah. And when I think about how, as you describe, and I've heard this, I've read this, and I understand that Belgians don't get that particular with that. Are they just kind of thinking that, well, this is beer flavored beer? It just happens to be brown,
It's
acidic, and come from barrels, as opposed to yellow and fizzy and boring.
it's not trying to avoid your question. Again, it's hard because you have different types of brewers. So
Yeah,
like, how can you
gotcha.
compare someone who is brewing a turbid mash, aging a beer for 3 years, aged
Yeah,
hops, and like does that for 30
and
years because
and
that's what his
that's it.
father did? How can you
That-
compare that to someone who
yeah,
is considering using the fresh harvest to dry hop a low ABV, very dry, like take something like XX bitter, right? You
yeah,
know, okay, they may share values, but in terms of the technical side of what they're doing, it's completely different. So, I mean, eh, maybe we can generalize about particular groups. So, for example, we can put Horal together, which is the spontaneous group. So, beers of spontaneous fermentation. So that's lambic, that's Huze, or Eau de Huze, depending on whose side you take in that discussion. Then you have the Belgian family brewers, who is a group of like 21, 22 brewers across Belgium, who are usually dominating their particular region, and who are, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 generations deep, generally producing a mix of lager, classic Belgian ales, and then they dabble in some mixed fermentation. The Traditionally, in the right up until the 90s, 2000s, lager was their key product, which tells you something about regional tastes.
hmm
Now, strong ales are the money ticket for the family brewers. So then you have that group, and then you have, let's say, the small independent wave, and those guys would be, I think, more attuned to the types of the craft that you're talking about, which is,
yeah,
let's try, to do a mix between a Cologne Kolsch and a dry German Pilsner. Let's try to do a a, a Belgian triple, but we're going to throw in some Simcoe. We'll throw in some Equinox. We'll maybe get some. You know what? Let's go Nelson Sauvin and try and make it white winey as well.
yeah,
Add in some grape must and do a re-fermentation, and maybe we'll even put that in wood. So they're kind of open to doing that type of thing. Um, they're, in a way, they're just experimenting and seeing where their sort of styles hit for themselves, satisfaction, and also for the market. Then you have the group of Oud Bruin breweries, which are kind of the four big ones: Van der Hinste, Verhagen, Rodenbach, and De Brabandere. You can probably throw Van Hunzenbroek into that and Isehem, and smaller ones like Alvina and Verzet, who are kind of independent. But those all they're all trying to, in a way, maintain the heritage of that style. Um, so you have all these kind of stratospheres, and then again within that, regional breweries are quite close, because even if they're not brewing the same thing, they might be relying on each other for getting to market. So the distribution in Belgium is very regional, and a lot of the best beer cafes are working with a particular distributor. So if you're based in East Flanders, you're going to be going to Oostakker to get your beers from Heers, and he's going to work with the breweries there. And if you go into the Ardennes, you're going to work with Del Sar, and if you're going to the West, you're working with Van de Woede. So they will have their own association. So there's all these kind of stratospheres. So this is why it's not to not answer your question, but this is why it's difficult to say the typical Belgian brewer will do this. What I would say is that there are a whole swathe of brewers who are doing what their father told them, and maybe not asking as many questions. Why do they not do that? Because there's a romance in doing what their father did and drinking the beers which their father did. Also, the beers are good. They may be conservative, they may be classic, but they are well constructed because of the landscape of Belgian beer. Even if a beer is considered boring by beer geeks, it will still be of a relatively high quality, which means well conditioned.
Because it's been refined and perfected over generations.
It's just, you just wouldn't get away with
Yeah.
selling something sloppy in the market. It would very quickly have to be remedied, or you're out, or people won't buy it again. So, and this is why international breweries can't penetrate the Belgian market. It's not that interesting because it's a small market, but there is a cachet that comes with selling your beer in Belgium. And I mean, I never come across foreign beer, whereas when I go everywhere else, you can get the national beer, but you can also get like 7, 8, 9 other countries
Yeah.
of excellent breweries from other countries. In Belgium, nobody wants to drink non-Belgian beer. Why would you? That's the attitude of Belgians. So, just to go back to your question about like the typical Belgian brewer, that's why it's difficult. But there is that conservative guy who's not that interested in getting so many online resources. They're going to use the same yeast maybe for all their beers. They're going to be careful about how it ferments out, how they condition, and their branding will also be very classic to serve a particular type of drinker. And then there's another group who will be really open, learn a lot, will try different ingredients, and yeah, everything in between.
Well, and what you're describing is just really explains why this is not a simple yes or no question, or a simple question of
No, but it sounds
style.
like I'm avoiding all your questions,
No,
and I'm
no, no,
and
no,
I'm
no.
I'm,
I
I'm trying to
actually,
qualify everything. I'm trying to explain the reason that
and
that
well, and I'm trying to wrap a little bow on this, because there is no simple thing, and that's why you can't just answer a question. You have to tell a story to better understand what's happening with Belgian beer, because it's not that simple. All of it is amazing, world class, tip of the spear, but it's not a simple, well, here's the beer flavored beer of Belgium. That doesn't exist. That concept doesn't exist. Do I understand that correctly?
I mean, well, if you're talking about beer flavored beer, I mean, are you talking about like lager, like a kind of European mass lager, or are you talking about?
No, I think the idea of when I say beer flavored beer in the U.S., it's easy to think mass produced American lager. When I say that phrase in Belgium, you're like, well, which one are you talking about? That's exactly my point.
Yeah, I think if you yeah, that's probably partially true. If you were to go like um the mass markets here still loves, so they drink a lot of European lager, and like there's a whole story about Belgian European Pilsner, which is not like like the kind of more mass produced Pilsner,
Hmm.
which I think is still really interesting.
Yeah,
But I mean,
delicious.
there's a really big market here for strong blonde ales. Um, so that's why there's a lot of breweries who I speak to who release triples reluctantly as a one-off, just to try it. Breweries that are kind of maybe a little bit trying to do something different or go against tradition, or make a statement, and then eventually they release a triple and it becomes their best-selling beer, because with the triple, the Belgian knows what he's getting. He's getting pronounced sort of yeast profile. He's getting alcohol. He's getting a lot of mouthfeel, and he can sit over that glass or that chalice, for a while, which is the drinking culture here. You go into a cafe, you get a menu, you select a beer that it's delivered and presented beautifully, with beautiful foam, in its own glassware, and you sit over that, in a cafe where they're taking care in how it's presented. Now that's there are great bars in other countries, but you know I have been to some pretty cafes in Belgium and been delivered perfect drinks, whether it's um, the little kind of ribbed tumbler pilsner glass, and they do
Hmm.
scoop off the foam, and like the foam is like perfectly 25% of the whole glass, and it's just so the bubbles are so tight, the lines are so clean, and it's delivered to me, perfectly dry with the little placemat. And they really keep their bottles really well, and they store them correctly. All their longer aging beers are stored sideways. They have baskets for pouring. Train station cafes, even. So I think that's also a big part of Belgian beer culture, which people mostly know about anyway.
Yeah.
But the theater, I call it the theater of Belgian beer, and it's like it's a really enjoyable experience to go and try beers like that.
Well, and that's a perception I have is I can go to a lot of different places and order beer, and sadly, most places just go, here's your beer, and it may or may not have foam on it. But the perception I have about Belgium, is you all have a wonderful way of getting the angels to sing every time you place a beer in the bar, and it kind of turn the presentation of a beer into the experience, where it's like, oh, I need to stop and just like and like talk about this before you even smell it, before you even taste it. There's a whole art to that seems to be that you guys have mastered.
Well, don't I'm not included because I'm not Belgian, but the Belgians have like
Well, you can pass it on then for me.
I mean the yeah, there's definitely that. I mean, it's also they just wouldn't accept it otherwise. I mean, you wouldn't be serving a beer in its wrong glass; it would just be sent back, or they'd be so embarrassed to serve that.
That'd be so
A
American.
beer without foam. I mean, if you talk to the guys at Duvel, they're like, our job is to serve you half a glass of foam, right? That's their
Yeah,
job. So if they don't have that 7.5 grams per liter of CO2 in the bottle, then that doesn't get released from the brewery.
yeah,
And there are issues with that, with pouring, and that's also part of why like hospitality staff have to understand, like, how to pour beer. So yeah, that's definitely a big part of it. I mean, all the stuff about you mentioned this earlier about the history, and it's not maybe as long a history as people sometimes make it out to be, and all the romanticism about the wild stuff that's jumping around in the air and jumps into the beer and magically makes it beautiful, and all the kind of the long heritage of, like, there is so much of it that is absolute bullshit, right? And obviously it's in the favor of the breweries to kind of um kind of prolong this for their own sort of marketing benefits. But for me, actually, it's in the kind of the reality of it, the kind of the dirty hard work, the kind of the people that have done sort of ingenious things to make something happen. That's, for me, is the romance of it. And um that's kind of, for me, those are the magical things, not the kind of the big stories about, like, the wine stories of chateaus and popes and all that sort of
yeah.
stuff.
I would agree, and that's where, going right back to the very beginning, you're talking about telling a story. It's human first. It's a story of people, the way how we connect, how we're different, how we're alike. When you really drill into it, I think that's the stuff that's just the most compelling. But just like the beer, you can't just share that quick anecdote and say it was awesome. You have to tell a better story. You have to create a better beer so that we go through that journey, we go through that experience. So on the other end, we realize, okay, now I get it, because you can't get it any other way.
Yeah, yeah.
Fair?
And like, don't be caught up in like all the romance. Just have your eye, keep your eyes up, because and it's also just going to lead to disappointment. People come, I see Americans come to Belgium all the time, and they're like, "Why is this place closed on a Tuesday afternoon, or like a Tuesday evening?" And I wanted to go for a drink, and it's like, "Oh, they don't have any of the beer that I wanted to try." But instead of that, ask them, "Oh, what's the most popular beer here?" Or have you got anything under the counter? And they'll just, or sometimes you've been in places and they're like, "Oh, we've got like a table down in the cellar. Do you want to come down and drink some natural wine?" It's like, "Yeah, sure." And those can be the best nights, Or you go into like a famous cafe that you've heard of that looks really shit and it's smaller than you thought, but actually it'll end up, if you give yourself over it, being one of the most enjoyable evenings where you'll meet the most interesting people and
Yeah.
just try stuff that you have never tried, and don't tick it off on Untapped. Just like, just savor it and savor the people that you're with, and that's how to enjoy Belgian beer. Don't put it in boxes. It's to go back to something we said earlier.
Yeah. Uh, sorry, I want to make a quick note of that. So we're getting on in time. There's a couple things I wanted to make sure I touch on. You've already kind of discussed this to a general extent. I'm going to try and press a little bit harder on this just to see what comes out of it. But for me and other people like me who've never been to Belgium, can't wait to go, can't wait to experience what the true Belgium experience is like, and not just what I've read in the books. How would you describe that Belgian culture?
Belgian culture generally, or Belgian beer culture?
Uh,
I mean, they're both they're both
all
they're
of it. I
both
mean it, and I
they're
and
both
I know,
related. Yeah.
yeah, they're
Um,
both related, and I know that's a big answer, but
it's a country that is um, it's a country that isn't a country. So it's very divided by its regionality and by its linguistic communities. Okay, so you know Flanders is not Wallonia, and the cantons where they speak German is not Brussels, which is a whole other animal. Um, and even provincially within Flanders, for example, there are some big differences in dialects and how people operate. But I think one thing they share is this kind of history of being ruled by different people and having to make things work. So, you know, the Spanish come through, the Austrians come through, the Germans come through, and rather than um, roll over, they kind of invent ways that they can profit. So this is how you develop things in terms of like uh, in their politics, but also in their beer and how they created certain things. So that's one thing, is like they're pretty pragmatic. They're also relatively reserved. So if you're looking at, and this is both like the personality of Belgians
mhm,
and in their institutions and stuff. So I mean, for example, if you look at Belgian beer, I mean, people know about it, but it's also considered a niche, I think. And the Belgians don't really sing about it in the way that they could, I think, given the kind of cachet that it has. Like in the same way that like the Dutch have confidence or the French talk about their wine, the Belgians aren't. They're proud of it, but they're not. They don't shout from the rooftops. They just kind of quietly get
but
on
they're
with
not
things.
jerks about it.
Yeah, well, they're just reserved, and that culturally that has a you know that shows up in a more reserved interaction. So you'll find when you talk to Belgians, um, they're not as maybe as warm and outgoing as say the Irish would be in how they would welcome you. But the long play with the Belgians is that like when you do get to know them, they'll do anything for you, and you can develop really strong relationships. So it's just like that kind of there is definitely some sort of a wall up at first. So culturally, that would be, if you were coming to Belgium, that's something that you'd notice, that in hospitality and getting things done, the bureaucracy, that it's not always easy.
Yeah.
But they're culturally, they absolutely, because of their location in like in Western Europe, because of their history of agriculture, they the port of Antwerp was a massive port for bringing in different foods from and cultures from around the world. They
Mm,
have a really good food and drink culture. So this is partly why their beer culture has evolved in the way that it has. That the way that they eat, like we talked about the theater of Belgian beer, the
yeah.
presentation, the glassware, um, the kind of the mix of flavors and stuff. All of this is like they call them the Burgondiers, which is like people who really enjoy eating and drinking. like from the Burgundy part of France. So they're the Burgunders of Belgium, and they have that food culture. So that's something that people will notice as well. Um, yeah, so that's kind of, those are three or four main things: pragmatism, um, strong beer and food culture, and quite reserved.
Well, and I love the idea of where you're not going to be necessarily they're not going to trip over themselves to welcome you necessarily, but once you get to know them, then you're in. And horrible analogy, but it's almost like when you're trying to get a good pair of hiking boots, and when you try them on in the store, and it's like, ooh, these feel tight, they feel stiff. I'm gonna have to break these in. But when you break those in, they will last forever, and they will just kiss your feet while you're hiking, as opposed to the ones like, oh, these feel amazing right now, but halfway down the trail, you got blisters. Horrible analogy. Please forgive it.
Belgians
But
are just like
I think
shoes that you
it's
have to break in.
yeah, right. Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
great. I love that.
That's the take home message from this podcast. You're welcome, everyone. See you later. but but I but that was the image that you conjured. It just like it's such a profound experience. I just couldn't come up with a better analogy, but I think it was apt. Um, before we start closing out, what are some of the things? If you were to make some predictions, what do you see in the next 10 years? Is there anything that you're excited about, beer culture wise, coming from Belgium?
um, the Belgian beer is quite slow moving, and
Mm,
like when you compare it to America, it's like, if someone makes a brewed IPA, within about 3 months there'll be about 4,000 brewed IPAs, right? If someone
yes.
makes a glitter beer, you'll have 100 glitter beers like in a week, right?
Oh
If
god,
someone
yes.
if someone makes, like, pastry stouts, all these are things that don't happen. I mean, they just don't happen in Belgium. I think even IPAs, they're in Brussels, for example. There's a lot of, especially with younger drinkers, there's a big demand for IPAs. But like in a kind of a classic drinking environment,
Mhm.
certain beers have become hoppier. Absolutely. So in terms of looking forward, I mean, the thing that I'm excited about is just seeing brewers uh, work on quality. The things that they're going to do are work on quality. So that's like um, how they're controlling fermentation temperature, how they're sourcing their ingredients, all the boring stuff that makes beer absolutely delicious and a great experience. Conditioning of the beer. Um, Given the market, I don't know how much like wild experimentation there's going to be. And post COVID, post pandemic, there's definitely a thing in the market here where people want familiarity more than they did pre pandemic. You also have a trend in Belgium, as it is globally, of people drinking, particularly young people drinking less alcohol. So my guess would be that there's a decline in the consumption of beer, but that people who are making high quality, interesting beers will still, people will still drink beer as a premium product. But maybe they'll just choose sort of more selectively. On the same point, there will be an increase in low and no alcohol beers, which is a big challenge for Belgium, which has largely been sort of a market dominated by higher alcohol. And
Yeah.
is replicating that flavor profile where you have, a lot of yeast flavor, a lot of phenol ester compounds, you have a lot of malt character, a lot of mouthfeel. Because replicating that in a low and no alcohol beer will lead to success, but the technology required is still a little bit too far for most breweries, even larger regional and family brewers who would have to make big investments. And a lot of that at the minute is being contracted with like three or four main facilities like the Proof and Anders and Martins and some other places like that. So
Mm.
where that goes, I'm very interested to see. Um, but it's always been slow moving, and while that I think has been frustrating for a lot of like beer enthusiasts in Belgium, why aren't we getting the glitter beer? Why aren't we getting,
Because you deserve better.
why aren't we getting cold IPAs? Why aren't we getting more double IPAs, that type of thing, or whatever
Mm.
the new thing is? Um, I think the fact that those things don't happen so quickly here protects protects the kind of the market a little bit. And there's this kind of there's enough experimentation going on here. I think that um, it keeps it pretty interesting. So um, I think it's really challenging times for Belgian brewers right now, just given the economic climate. And the other thing is, like, and I'm sure it's the same in America, but in Belgium, beer, the price point of beer is quite low, so the margins are low. So if all of a
Hmm.
sudden energy costs and um your raw materials are a lot more expensive, like you look at some of these guys that are getting even their CO2 for flushing tanks and like for carbonating kegs, they're all like 4 or 5 times more expensive now.
Yeah.
So that makes it difficult because Belgians won't pay. So if I give you a Westmalle triple, which is a 9.5% banana, creamy beer that's kind of always on point, and I give you that, you're not going to pay more. You're going to be expecting to pay between like 350 and 450 euros, right? Depending on where you are. You know, Belgians aren't going to pay if they're not going to pay more than 450 or €5 for a Westmalle triple. How the hell are you going to get them to pay for your breweries, whatever it is? So you have to be competitive on price
Yeah.
to move the volume. And with these kind of margins now being pushed or squeezed a lot by these rising costs, I think it's a really difficult time. So, but again, Belgian brewers are pragmatic and they are really good at problem solving. So this is also something I'm kind of keeping my ear on the ground to see how people are going to change the way that their business operates. Maybe the focus on a particular range, how they're going to try and generate revenue, how they're going to partner with other people where maybe they haven't done before. So, this is if there's a country that's going to make it work, it's definitely going to be Belgium.
I always I'd never advocate that we pay more for anything, um, but I have observed and taken note that when I go to any brewery around the world, around the country, that the brewery itself, sometimes they're a little bit nicer, sometimes they're a little bit more humble, but invariably, anytime I go to a winery, those things are palatial, and there's a little disparity about how much we pay for wine and how much we pay for beer, and what those producing entities look like. Um, so I'm just going to leave that there, and anyone listening or watching can draw your own conclusions, and we'll move on from there. Um, thank you for your time. I got a couple of closeout questions before we go. Um, real fun. If you, I mean, obviously, you move around a little bit, at least as far as we know, from Ireland to Belgium. But if you could go anywhere in the world to have a meal and a beer, where would you go and what would you have?
I mean, do I have to make this decision based on the beer, or can it be the whole experience?
Whatever you wish.
I would go. It's an easy answer. I would go to a pub in the northwest of Ireland, County Donegal, out by Dewey Beach, sort of next stop Iceland if you get in the water, and it's very remote. It's um, it's very beautiful, very dramatic landscape, as wild as you can get. And there's a pub there called Elliot's, which has both a few bottles of inverted commas craft beer from a very good Donegal brewery called Kinniger, but they also have all the big macro beers like Smithwick's and Guinness. So I'd probably work my way through the 3 or 4 beers they have on offer there and sit in front of a fire, and reminisce on my childhood days up on the northwest coast of Ireland, with the Atlantic Sea bashing up against the beach and the wind howling outside, and the quality time spent with my brothers and my parents and enjoying the kind of that's the beauty of the Irish pub atmosphere.
Mm.
Um, a million miles away from Belgium. Um, any beer experience I would want to go across the world, I probably choose Belgium because of there's so many places I haven't experienced. There's so much beauty, particularly in the south of Belgium. Um, and it's those kind of little pokey sort of understated cafes that look really shitty and broken, that you end up having like the most wonderful beer experiences that no one else maybe goes to. So that's not that glamorous. Of course, everyone. I want to go to the caves in Pilsner Quell, and of course, I want to go to Maine and drink, Allagash fresh draft, and yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, of course, but take me to Dewey, to Dookery in County Donegal, and give me a pint of something black.
Well, and I think that is especially compelling because your first thought was to go somewhere that gives you a sense of home. And
Uh,
and and when I think about one of my favorite, if I could choose my last meal, last beer type of thing before I depart, not that is what this is, but one of my top things is I want to go back to the beach. I want to have a nice Mexican lager and either tacos or a plate of nachos because I grew up in the Southern California beach, and just that experience, that listening to the seagulls caw 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 and drive you crazy. There's something special about that moment, and so I'm with you on that one. I think I'll be wearing flip flops in my version, and,
yeah, yeah.
not a
I'll be
cable
in
knit
like a
sweater.
warm woolly jumper and yeah, Aaron sweater.
Yeah. Um, Another thing I just got to ask you is, why does good beer matter so much to you? I think we probably hit on some of these points, but I mean, why does it matter so much to you?
Um, you've mentioned a few times about the beer itself. I always go back to the human part of it because to me, beer is the most human thing. It's something that it comes from some grain that somebody's grown, some hop that somebody's grown. It's all the decisions that the brewer has made in packaging and fermentation, and everything. So why it matters is that someone has taken care to produce this for some reason that's personal to them, and now I get to enjoy it. And in a way, the more work and the more care that they've put into it, the less I have to work or think about things, and I can just enjoy it. So that's the way I always see it. Is like, has this brewer or these people, have they worked as hard as they can to make me not work at all? And that's why it matters. It's like, you do the hours of cleaning so that I don't have to worry about infections. You do the hours of calculating and trials so that I don't have to worry about how, the beer not being dry enough or whatever it is. And if you do all that and work your ass off, then I'll continue to enjoy and buy your beer. And it's a very, very human product.
Yeah, because if they mess up the beer, it's not going to take you on that experience, or it's not going to take you home to Dewey Beach.
Yeah, it won't matter.
Yeah, awesome. So where can people find you? Where can people find Belgian Smaak?
We're belgiansmack.com, and then all the social handles are Belgian Smack. So join the newsletter and you'll basically find out about all the stories, all the podcasts, and anything that we're working on at the minute. So yeah, belgiansmack.com.
Awesome. And Breandán, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. Thank you for the work you're doing and the stories you're telling. And I just love this conversation. We got to talk about many things, but especially we got to talk about beer, culture, and storytelling. Those are probably my three favorite things. So thank you.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Because I haven't yet traveled to Belgium myself, it's easy for me to make assumptions about the culture based upon my experience with the beer. But we must remember that beer can serve as a tool and a doorway. It's not designed to answer questions. It's meant to elicit them. In the next episode, we continue our beer travels, but this time we head to England and somewhere much closer to home. I'm on a virtual tour of the craft and culture of beer around the globe. I've put Good Beer Matters on video so I can take you along for the ride. If you know of a person, a place, or a beer story that needs to be told, let me know. Meanwhile, grab a beer, hang out with friends, and let your world open up. Thank you for listening. Cheers.